So here's the thing about galactic politics. It's basically high school with plasma rifles and the power to glass entire star systems. And just like high school, everyone thinks they're the main character in their own little drama, completely oblivious to the fact that the quiet kid in the corner, yeah, that's humanity, has been taking notes. Detailed notes. The Galactic Council had what they like to call protocols. Fancy word for rules we made up to keep the new kids from getting too uppity. And humanity? Well, we were definitely the new kids. Fresh off our little blue marble, still figuring out which end of a plasma cutter was the business end. Stumbling around the galaxy like tourists who'd accidentally wandered into the VIP section of the universe's most exclusive club. The thing is, when you're the new species on the block, everyone wants to test you. See what you're made of. Find your breaking point. It's like cosmic hazing, except instead of making you drink questionable liquids, they mess with your colonies, accidentally intercept your supply shipments, and generally treat you like the universe's favorite chew toy. Most species, when faced with this kind of treatment, either rolled over and showed their bellies, or puffed up their chest feathers, metaphorically speaking, though the Cathara actually did have chest feathers, and declared righteous war on everyone within a 12-parsec radius. Both approaches were expected. Both were manageable. What the Council wasn't expecting was Lieutenant Commander Alexander Alex Kane. Now, before we get into the good stuff, and trust me, it gets really good, let me paint you a picture of our protagonist. Alex Kane was what you might call aggressively competent, the kind of person who color-coded his ammunition and kept his plasma rifle so clean you could perform surgery on it. He had the sort of smile that made diplomats nervous, and the kind of reputation that made pirates suddenly remember urgent business in the next system over. But here's where it gets interesting. Alex wasn't just good at his job. He was creatively good at his job. While most humans in the Colonial Defense Force were content to follow standard protocols, shoot the bad guys, protect the civilians, file the paperwork in triplicate, Alex had a nasty habit of thinking beyond conventional parameters. Far beyond conventional parameters. Sometimes he thought so far outside standard operating procedures that the procedures filed a formal complaint. And on the day our story begins, the Galactic Council's Science Committee had just handed him the perfect excuse to get creative. The message arrived on a Tuesday, which should have been everyone's first warning. Nothing good ever happens on a Tuesday. Mondays are for disasters, sure, but Tuesdays? Tuesdays are for the kind of slow-burning catastrophes that start with someone saying, "Hey, you know what would be interesting?" The transmission came through official channels, stamped with the Council's seal and everything. Very proper, very legitimate. The kind of document that made middle managers everywhere break out in a cold sweat. To the human colonial authority, it began. Because apparently the Council had never heard of starting with hello, like civilized beings. In accordance with Protocol 7 Alpha concerning the scientific evaluation of emerging species' cognitive and adaptive capabilities, the Science Committee hereby requests permission to conduct a limited observational study of human colonial settlement, KC-7741. KC-7741. They couldn't even be bothered to use the actual name. Meridian's Rest. A small farming colony on the edge of human space, population roughly 3,000, known primarily for its excellent wheat production and its relatively peaceful existence. Until now. The document went on in that special bureaucratic language that somehow managed to use 50 words where 5 would do. But the gist of it was simple. We want to mess with your people to see what happens. Oh, they dressed it up nice. Called it controlled environmental stressors and adaptive response monitoring. But strip away the fancy terminology, and what you had was the galactic equivalent of pulling the wings off flies to see how they'd react. Most species governments would have read this, hemmed and hawed, maybe filed a formal protest that would disappear into the Council's bureaucratic black hole. Some might have refused outright and dealt with the diplomatic consequences later. The human colonial authority did something different. They forwarded the message to Alex Kane with a note that simply read, "Your call, Commander." Now you have to understand something about the way humanity approached galactic politics. While other species had entire departments dedicated to diplomatic protocol and interstellar relations, humans had taken a more streamlined approach. The basic philosophy was this: if someone wants to poke you with a stick to see what happens, it's only polite to show them exactly what happens, in vivid, unforgettable detail. Alex was sitting in his quarters aboard the Defiant Optimism. And yes, that was really the ship's name, because human ship naming conventions were apparently designed by either comedians or people with severe mental health issues. When the message came through, he read it once, then twice, then a third time, while his eyebrows climbed steadily toward his hairline. Well, he said to his empty room, because talking to yourself is perfectly normal when you're 3 months into a deep space patrol. That's interesting. He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against his desk. The smart play here was obvious. File a polite response declining the experiment. Maybe suggest some alternative that didn't involve using human colonists as lab rats. But Alex Kane hadn't gotten where he was by making smart plays. He reached for his communicator. "Communications, patch me through to Admiral Brooks." "Yes, sir. One moment." Admiral Brooks appeared on his screen a few minutes later, looking like he'd just been woken up from a nap. Which, knowing Brooks, he probably had been. The man could sleep through a supernova if it meant getting his regulation 8 hours. "Kane," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Please tell me you're calling to report that your patrol sector is boring and peaceful and that absolutely nothing requiring my attention has happened." "I'm afraid not, sir. We've received an interesting communication from the Galactic Council." Brooks's expression shifted from sleepy annoyance to alert concern. "Define interesting." "They want to experiment on Meridian's Rest." "Come again?" Alex forwarded the document and waited while Brooks read through it. He could practically see the man's blood pressure rising with each paragraph. Those sanctimonious, arrogant, condescending... Brooks caught himself mid-rant and took a deep breath. "What's our play here, Commander?" And there it was. The moment that would define everything that came after. Alex could have recommended the safe option, the diplomatic option, the option that wouldn't potentially start the galaxy's most creative war. Instead, he smiled. "Well, sir, they want to conduct an experiment. I think we should let them." "Kane." "With one small modification," he continued, and Brooks suddenly looked like a man who'd just realized he was standing in a minefield. "They want to see how humans respond to controlled stressors. I propose we show them exactly what human ingenuity looks like when properly motivated." There was a long pause. Then Brooks began to grin. "You magnificent, terrifying bastard. What do you have in mind?" "The thing about humans, as any xenobiologist worth their tentacles will tell you, is that we're pattern recognition machines. We see connections where other species see random events. We find meaning in chaos. And when someone deliberately introduces variables into our environment to study our responses, we tend to notice. More importantly, we tend to get creative about it." The Council's experiment began subtly, as these things usually do. A delayed supply shipment here, a communication blackout there, some routine maintenance on the orbital relay that just happened to coincide with Meridian's Rest's monthly check-in. To any outside observer, it would look like the normal chaos of interstellar logistics. Stuff happens. Ships break down. Bureaucrats lose paperwork. Nothing to get excited about. But Alex had sent a very special message to Meridian's Rest before the experiment began. It was encoded in a frequency that looked like background radiation, buried in what appeared to be a routine weather update. And it said just 4 words. "Game on. Play along." Dr. Elizabeth Vance, Meridian's Rest's chief administrator, was many things. A competent bureaucrat, a decent amateur botanist, and someone who could organize a town meeting with military precision. But she was also, in her younger days, a graduate of the Colonial Defense Force's Advanced Tactical Planning School, which is a fancy way of saying she knew exactly how to make someone's life miserable while maintaining plausible deniability. When the first routine inspections began, Council science teams arriving unannounced to take readings and samples, Dr. Vance was the picture of cooperation. She provided everything they asked for, answered every question, and made sure they had complete access to whatever they wanted to study. She also made sure they got the full Meridian's Rest experience. The first team arrived on a Wednesday, because apparently the Council's sense of timing was as questionable as their sense of ethics, and was greeted by Dr. Vance personally. She was all smiles and helpfulness as she escorted them to their temporary research facility, a prefabricated building that just happened to be located downwind from the colony's waste processing plant. "I'm so sorry about the smell," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "But this was the only location that met your technical specifications for soil composition and electromagnetic neutrality." The lead researcher, a tall insectoid being from the Zelani Consortium, twitched his antennae in what might have been annoyance. "This is acceptable," he buzzed through his translator. "Wonderful! Now, I've arranged for you to have complete freedom to conduct your research. The colonists have been informed that they should treat you as honored guests and respond to any reasonable requests." Keyword reasonable. What followed was 3 weeks of the most politely malicious compliance in human history. When the research team requested interviews with colonists about their adaptation strategies, they got them. All of them. Every single colonist on Meridian's Rest suddenly developed an overwhelming desire to share their thoughts on adaptive strategies. For hours, in excruciating detail, Farmer Williams spent an entire afternoon explaining his 17-point plan for optimal crop rotation, complete with charts he'd drawn on the back of seed packets. Mrs. Henderson from the schoolhouse delivered a 4-hour lecture on educational adaptability in resource-limited environments that covered everything from teaching multiplication with wheat kernels to using local minerals for art projects. The research team's request for behavioral observation during normal daily activities was met with enthusiastic cooperation. The colonists went about their daily routines exactly as they always did, except now they provided running commentary. "Now I'm walking to the water pump," announced Jim Torres, the colony's head mechanic, as he strolled across the town square. "This is an adaptation to our need for hydration. Notice how I'm avoiding the muddy patch near the community center. That's what we call environmental awareness." Behind him, 3 Zolani researchers frantically took notes while trying to keep up with his deliberately circuitous route to the pump. The observation requests escalated. The research team wanted to monitor stress responses to resource scarcity, so Dr. Vance obligingly instituted conservation measures: water rationing, power limitations, restricted access to certain food stores, all implemented with cheerful efficiency, and detailed explanations of how these measures would help the research team gather better data. The colonists adapted beautifully. They formed committees to manage the new restrictions, developed innovative workarounds for the limitations, and generally displayed exactly the kind of human ingenuity and cooperation that the council wanted to study. They also made sure the research team got to experience every adaptation firsthand. When the water was rationed, the researchers found that their facility's pipes had developed a mysterious tendency to run dry just as they were trying to clean their equipment. When power was limited, their research station somehow always ended up at the bottom of the priority list for the evening power allocation. "I'm so sorry," Dr. Vance would say, not looking sorry at all. "But the community voted, and we have to prioritize essential services first. The school and medical center need power more than your atmospheric analyzers." The fact that the local residents had somehow organized the community voting system to ensure this outcome every single night was just a happy coincidence. By the second week, the research team was starting to look a little frayed around the edges. The constant interviews, the environmental challenges, and the colonists' relentless cheerfulness were wearing them down. But the real masterpiece came when they requested access to conflict resolution protocols. Dr. Vance practically glowed with enthusiasm. "Of course, we'd be happy to demonstrate our conflict resolution methods. In fact, we have a perfect opportunity coming up." She organized a town meeting to discuss resource allocation priorities, a bureaucratic way of saying let's argue about stuff. But this wasn't just any town meeting. This was a town meeting designed by someone who understood that humans could turn literally anything into a debate, and who had specifically chosen topics guaranteed to generate passionate but ultimately pointless arguments. The agenda included items like, should the community center's bulletin board be organized alphabetically or chronologically? Is it more efficient to collect rainwater in large containers or multiple small ones? What's the optimal walking speed for daily errands, brisk efficiency or leisurely observation? For 3 hours, the colonists engaged in spirited debates about these earth-shattering issues. They formed factions, cited precedent, made impassioned speeches, and generally turned municipal administration into a spectator sport. The research team sat in the back, frantically trying to categorize what they were witnessing. Was this conflict? Cooperation? Some bizarre hybrid of both? The meeting ended with a vote to establish a subcommittee to investigate the possibility of forming a working group to evaluate the potential formation of a task force to study the bulletin board issue. The motion passed unanimously. Meanwhile, back on the Defiant Optimism, Alex was monitoring the situation with the kind of professional satisfaction that comes from watching a plan unfold exactly as intended. The reports from the council research team were illuminating. Day 12. Subjects continue to display unprecedented levels of cooperation despite artificial stressors. However, efficiency of research operations has declined significantly due to logistical complications. Day 18. Request additional supplies. Current food stores contaminated by local allergen. Colonists describe it as seasonal pollen, but our analysis suggests deliberate introduction. Subjects have offered to share their food supplies, but local cuisine appears to be specifically designed to challenge non-human digestive systems. Day 23. Research team morale declining. Subjects' constant helpfulness and detailed explanations of every action are proving mentally exhausting. Request permission to abbreviate study duration. Alex forwarded each report to Admiral Brooks with increasingly brief commentary. His messages went from proceeding as expected to as planned to simply, "Ha." By day 25, the reports had taken on a distinctly desperate tone. Day 25, urgent, request immediate extraction. Subjects have begun helping with research data collection. They are volunteering to assist with equipment calibration, offering suggestions for improved observation techniques, and providing unsolicited analysis of their own behavioral patterns. Local administrator has proposed that the colonists write their own research conclusions to save time and improve accuracy. This level of cooperation is unprecedented and potentially dangerous to research validity. Day 27. Cannot establish meaningful control group as entire population is now aware of and actively participating in the study. Subjects are displaying metacognitive awareness of experimental parameters and are adjusting their behavior accordingly. This is not normal. This is not normal. Day 30. They're teaching us their games. Send help. The final report arrived exactly 31 days after the experiment began, which was somehow perfectly appropriate for what had become the galaxy's first recorded case of weaponized hospitality. Final report: Meridian's Rest Behavioral Study. After 31 days of observation, this research team regretfully concludes that the human subjects of Colony KC-7741 represent an unprecedented challenge to standard experimental protocols. Initial hypothesis suggested that controlled environmental stressors would produce measurable behavioral changes consistent with adaptation patterns observed in other sentient species. Instead, subjects demonstrated what can only be described as aggressive accommodation. Rather than adapting to imposed stresses, subjects adapted the stresses to their preferred operational parameters. They transformed artificial scarcity into community-building exercises, turned observation protocols into educational opportunities, and converted research procedures into elaborate social rituals. Most concerning, subjects appear to have identified the experimental nature of their situation, and, rather than protesting or withdrawing cooperation, have enthusiastically embraced their role as research participants. They are now requesting detailed feedback on their performance, and have submitted formal proposals for additional experiments they believe would provide more comprehensive data. This level of engagement suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of the researcher-subject relationship and indicates that further study of this population would be inadvisable. Recommendation: classify this species as unsuitable for standard research protocols and file appropriate warnings in the xenological database. Addendum: Colony Administrator has invited research team to attend their Harvest Festival next month and has specifically requested that we bring friends because the more the merrier. Strongly recommend that no council personnel accept this invitation. End report. Dr. Zektar Nim, lead researcher PS, they gave us a going-away party. With cake. I don't know what to do with this information. Alex read the final report 3 times, then forwarded it to Admiral Brooks with a single word: success. His response came back within minutes. You beautiful, diabolical genius. Drinks are on me when you get back. But the real payoff came 2 days later, when the Galactic Council's Science Committee issued an official statement. Following comprehensive evaluation of human colonial settlement KC-7741, the Science Committee has determined that standard research protocols are incompatible with human behavioral patterns. Future observational studies of human populations are suspended pending development of appropriate methodological frameworks. In diplomatic language, that translated to, these people are too weird to study properly, and we're not sure we want to understand them anyway. Mission accomplished. Of course, the story doesn't end there. Because this is humanity we're talking about. And humans have a particular talent for taking a good idea and pushing it far beyond the point of reason. Dr. Vance's final report to the Colonial Authority was a masterpiece of bureaucratic creativity. She recommended that Meridian's Rest be designated as a cultural exchange facility, specifically for hosting alien research teams who wanted to study human behavior. We've developed considerable expertise in managing these types of interactions, she wrote. And the colonists have expressed strong interest in continuing to participate in cross-species research initiatives. The subtext was clear. You want to experiment on humans? Fine. But it's going to be on our terms, and you're going to get more than you bargained for. Within 6 months, Meridian's Rest had become the galaxy's premier destination for xenological research. Not because it provided good data, quite the opposite. But because it had become the cosmic equivalent of a practical joke that everyone wanted to be in on. Research teams would arrive expecting to conduct serious scientific studies and would leave with detailed knowledge of human agricultural techniques, 17 different recipes for wheat-based desserts, and a standing invitation to next year's Harvest Festival. The colony's population grew as word spread. Scientists, diplomats, and random curiosity seekers from across the galaxy started making pilgrimages to this little farming world where humans had turned being studied into an art form. The colonists embraced their new role with typical human enthusiasm. They started offering guided tours of their daily adaptive behaviors, organized workshops on conflict resolution through committee formation, and established an annual conference on interspecies cooperation through aggressive helpfulness. But perhaps the most beautiful part of the whole situation was what happened to the original research team. Dr. Zektar Nim, the lead researcher who'd survived 31 days of weaponized hospitality, filed a request to return to Meridian's Rest. Not for research purposes, he'd learned that lesson, but as what he called a participant observer in ongoing cultural exchange programs. He wanted to go back. When questioned by his superiors about this unusual request, his explanation was both simple and profound. They invited me to their harvest festival. It would be rude not to attend. He wasn't the only one. Within a year, 3 of the original research team members had applied for extended stays on Meridian's Rest. One of them, a Kithara xenobiologist named Chitara, eventually became the colony's first permanent alien resident. Her dissertation on adaptive community formation in multi-species agricultural settings was later required reading at xenological institutes across the galaxy. Chapter 4 was titled, "But Seriously, You Have to Try the Cake." The ripple effects spread far beyond one small farming colony. The Council's Science Committee, faced with the uncomfortable realization that their standard research methods were apparently useless when applied to humans, began questioning their approaches to other species as well. It turned out that when you stop treating people like lab rats and start treating them like, well, people, you get much better data. Who could have predicted that? The Meridian's Rest Protocol became the new standard for xenological research. Instead of imposing artificial stresses and observing responses, researchers were encouraged to simply ask their subjects what they thought about things. Revolutionary concept, really, but the humans weren't done. Because humans are never done. Dr. Vance, now recognized as the galaxy's leading expert on applied cooperative resistance, started consulting for other colonies facing similar research requests. Her methods spread throughout human space and beyond. Within 2 years, the phrase, "they're pulling a Meridian's Rest," had entered common usage in diplomatic circles. It meant responding to attempted manipulation with such enthusiastic cooperation that the manipulator ended up more confused than the target. The technique proved remarkably effective against everything from trade negotiation hardball tactics to military intimidation campaigns. It's hard to threaten someone who responds to your threats by offering helpful suggestions for making them more effective. Alex, meanwhile, had been promoted to admiral and given command of the Colonial Defense Force's new Cultural Interface Division. His official job description read like something out of a diplomatic handbook, but everyone knew what he really did. He made sure that when someone tried to mess with humans, they got the response they deserved. His methods had evolved beyond the Meridian's Rest operation. The Cultural Interface Division had developed a whole arsenal of techniques for dealing with problematic alien powers. There was the helpful neighbor protocol for overly aggressive trade partners, the concerned friend approach for species that tried to play political games, and the devastating educational opportunity response for anyone foolish enough to underestimate human creativity. But his masterpiece, the operation that cemented his reputation as the galaxy's most dangerous diplomat, came 3 years later when the hegemony of Vel decided to test human military resolve by conducting training exercises, uncomfortably close to human colonies. Alex's response was simple. He invited them to participate in human military training exercises. All of them. Every single hegemony ship in the area. The resulting 2-week joint training operation became legendary in military circles. The hegemony forces, expecting to demonstrate their superior technology and tactics, instead found themselves learning human approaches to logistics, maintenance, crew coordination, and something called tactical improvisation. By the end of the exercises, hegemony officers were taking notes on human supply chain management techniques and asking for copies of human training manuals. The joint operation ended with a formal ceremony where the hegemony fleet commander presented Alex with their highest military decoration for outstanding contribution to interspecies military cooperation. He kept it on his desk right next to his collection of thank you cards from Meridian's Rest. Looking back on it all, the really remarkable thing wasn't what humanity accomplished, but how they accomplished it. Most species, when faced with condescension and manipulation, respond with either submission or aggression. Humans chose a third option, aggressive kindness. They turned being underestimated into an advantage. They made their supposed weakness, their tendency to cooperate and help others, into their greatest strength. And they did it all with a smile. The Galactic Council never did figure out how to classify humanity properly. Their files listed humans as unpredictable, unsuitable for standard protocols, and most tellingly, recommend caution, may respond to research attempts with excessive cooperation. But perhaps the most accurate description came from an anonymous council bureaucrat who was overheard saying, "They're either the most dangerous species in the galaxy or the most helpful, and honestly, I'm not sure there's a difference." 5 years after the Meridian's Rest experiment, Admiral Kane was invited to speak at the Galactic Council's annual Xenological Conference. His topic, Effective Interspecies Communication, a Human Perspective. He opened his presentation with a simple statement. When someone wants to study you, it's only polite to make sure they learn something useful. The audience, researchers, diplomats, and academics from across the galaxy, nodded politely, not quite sure what he meant. By the end of his presentation, they understood. Kane had turned his speech into a masterclass in human diplomatic philosophy. He explained how humanity had developed their approach to galactic politics, shared case studies from various cultural exchange programs, and provided practical guidance for other species dealing with similar challenges. But the real genius was in the structure of the presentation itself. Without anyone quite realizing it, he had turned the entire conference into a demonstration of human communication techniques. The question and answer session lasted 3 hours. Representatives from dozens of species wanted to know more about human methods, human philosophy, human approaches to conflict resolution. By the time it was over, the Galactic Council had inadvertently learned more about humanity than they'd managed to gather in all their previous research attempts combined. And humanity had gained dozens of new allies, trade partners, and friends. The conference organizers gave Kane a standing ovation and an honorary doctorate in xenological studies. He accepted both graciously and invited everyone to next year's expanded Harvest Festival on Meridian's Rest. "We're expecting quite a crowd this year," he said. "Should be fun." The final word on the whole affair came from Dr. Zektar Nim, the original researcher who'd started it all. His memoir, 31 Days Among Humans, A Survivor's Guide, became a bestseller across the galaxy. The conclusion was both simple and profound. I came to study humans. They ended up studying me, and somehow we all learned something valuable in the process. I'm still not sure how they managed it, but I suspect that's exactly the point. Humans don't just adapt to their environment. They adapt their environment to themselves, and then they invite you to be part of it. It's the most terrifying and wonderful thing I've ever experienced. I can't wait to go back. And that, friends, is the story of how humanity turned an insulting research proposal into the galaxy's most successful cultural exchange program, transformed a small farming colony into an interstellar diplomatic center, and convinced the entire Galactic Council that maybe, just maybe, they should try asking nicely before attempting to experiment on people. They called it an experiment. Dr. Vance called it a declaration of war. History called it the beginning of humanity's golden age of galactic diplomacy. But the colonists of Meridian's Rest? They just called it Tuesday, and they were already planning something special for next week. After all, the Andromedans had just sent a very interesting research proposal. The end.